Ethan Cole sat alone in his corner office, staring at the city lights he once loved. The building was quiet now, only the soft hum of computers filling the air. On his desk sat a small birthday cake he had meant to send to his brother-in-law Mark. But he hadn't. He couldn't. Because the truth was, Mark wasn't just family, he was the one Ethan couldn't stop thinking about. What started as an affair had turned into something darker, something Ethan couldn't control. And tonight, that secret was about to destroy everything. Ethan Cole had built his company from nothing. To everyone outside, he looked like success itself. Sharp, confident, always in control. But behind the clean suits and steady smile, Ethan hid something he didn't understand himself. He was a man who craved love yet couldn't handle it when it came. That need had driven him into the one place he swore he'd never go, into an affair with Mark, his wife's brother. Every time he told himself to stop, his heart ignored him, and his mind built another lie to keep it going. Mark had joined Ethan's company as an architect a few months earlier. He was different from everyone else there. Creative, kind, unbothered by power. Ethan admired that. What started as long meetings turned into small smiles and soon into something neither of them could name. Ethan felt alive around him, seen in a way no one else had managed. But he also knew the risk. Every message, every secret meeting felt like walking on glass. The thrill kept him going, but deep down, guilt was growing fast under the surface. Ethan's wife, Claire, noticed the change before anyone else did. He had always been distant, but now he was distracted in a new way. She asked if something was wrong, and he said it was just work. But even as he said it, he couldn't meet her eyes. He started spending more nights at the office, blaming projects that didn't exist. The lie felt easy at first, like a necessary layer of control, but control was slipping, and Ethan knew that if anyone connected the dots between him and Mark, everything would collapse overnight. The affair began quietly, a late-night drink after a meeting, a drive home that turned into a moment that crossed every line. It wasn't planned, it just happened, and once it did, Ethan couldn't stop. Mark was torn between guilt and emotion, while Ethan convinced himself it was love. In truth, it was something far messier, a need for validation that no one else had ever given him. Every message they shared made the lie grow stronger. And every morning Ethan woke up promising it was the last time. It never was. Ethan began to take unnecessary risks. He scheduled extra meetings just to see Mark, creating excuses even when they had no work to discuss. The office walls that once felt like his kingdom now felt like a trap filled with eyes watching him. The air between them changed. Simple conversations carried hidden tension. Ethan's pulse raced whenever Mark entered the room. He lived for those moments, but they also made him restless. He couldn't decide if he wanted to protect the secret or have it discovered so he could stop pretending. The company thrived, but Ethan's judgment began to slip. He made impulsive decisions, ignoring his team's concerns. Investors praised his vision but whispered about his behavior. Claire invited him to dinner with her family, and he refused with a cold excuse about deadlines. Mark tried to pull away, but Ethan kept finding ways to bring him back. Every time he said he loved him, Mark went quiet. That silence scared Ethan more than anything. It meant Mark was already halfway out of the door, and Ethan couldn't handle being left again. Ethan's nights grew longer. He stayed in his glass-walled office even when the lights of the city dimmed. The silence comforted him in a strange way, like a punishment he deserved. He'd scroll through old emails from Mark, reading the same words over and over until they lost meaning. He thought about confessing to Claire just to end the weight of it all. But he didn't. He needed both of them for different reasons. Love and image. One fed his heart, the other his ego. Losing either felt like losing himself. Mark tried to keep things professional, but Ethan refused to let go. He sent long messages late at night talking about how they were meant for each other. Mark didn't reply most of the time. That silence made Ethan angry, desperate even. He started showing up unannounced at sites where Mark worked. People began to notice, whispering that the CEO seemed overly involved. Ethan didn't care. He told himself it was love, but it was control. The same control that had built his empire was now slowly breaking it apart. Claire grew colder. She had stopped asking questions and started watching instead. Ethan could feel it in the way she looked at him across the dinner table. He tried to act normal, but every word felt like a lie. He couldn't remember the last time he'd looked at her without guilt. Yet even then he didn't stop. He told himself Mark needed him, that their connection was real, that it meant something more. But in truth, it was Ethan who needed Mark, to feel wanted, seen, and powerful again. The company celebrated another profitable quarter. Ethan stood on the stage, smiling for photos, clapping for his employees. But his eyes searched the crowd for one person, Mark. When he saw him at the back, smiling politely, Ethan's chest tightened. Everyone around him saw a confident leader. Only he knew the panic under that mask. Later that night, as everyone left, Ethan found Mark alone near the parking lot. They talked quietly, too close for comfort. What started as a short moment turned into something that changed everything between them. That night, Ethan crossed a line he couldn't uncross. What began as a look became a touch, and what began as a touch became something neither of them could hide. The guilt hit instantly, but the pull was stronger. Ethan felt alive again for the first time in years. Mark, on the other hand, looked broken. They both knew it couldn't last, but they didn't stop. It became their secret. Thrilling, dangerous, addictive. The more they tried to bury it, the deeper it grew, spreading like a crack through everything Ethan built. Ethan started changing. He smiled more in public but avoided people in private. His focus drifted. Important meetings slipped his mind. His assistant noticed he was distracted. His mind somewhere else. He began to treat Mark differently at work. Colder in meetings, too intense in private. He wanted to keep things hidden. But emotions don't follow rules. The company felt his instability long before anyone knew why. Ethan thought he could manage both love and power, but soon even he realized that one was destroying the other, piece by piece. Mark tried to end things, saying it wasn't right. Ethan promised he'd fix everything, but he never did. Instead, he tightened his grip, afraid of losing him. He started showing jealousy whenever Mark talked to anyone else. Every smile, every text, every name that came up near Mark made Ethan's chest burn. He didn't recognize himself anymore. He had always prided himself on control, but now he was ruled by obsession. And in trying to hold on to love, he was slowly turning it into something poisonous. Claire found the first clue by accident. While cleaning the kitchen, she discovered a small birthday cake box in the fridge labeled with Mark's name. Ethan had forgotten to send it. It was small, harmless, but it didn't feel right. She noticed the date matched a night. Ethan said he'd been working late. Something clicked in her mind. Something she couldn't unsee. She didn't confront him yet. She just watched quietly as her husband began to crumble without realizing she already knew the truth was close to catching him. Ethan felt the shift in the air at home. Claire's silence was heavy now, not angry but observant. He pretended not to notice, throwing himself deeper into work. He started pushing projects that made no sense, just to keep busy. He couldn't focus on numbers or clients, only on Mark. He began skipping meals, ignoring sleep. The man who once managed empires was now chasing a single person's attention. Every lie he told dug the hole deeper, and somewhere inside he already knew he wouldn't climb back out. Ethan started making decisions no one understood. He approved a risky deal just because Mark was part of it. When his team questioned him, he brushed them off with irritation. The company that once respected him began to whisper. Investors noticed his impatience and the mistakes piling up. But Ethan didn't care. The only thing that mattered was keeping Mark close, even if it meant burning everything else. He convinced himself that love needed sacrifice, but what he was really doing was losing control of everything he once thought he could manage. A project prototype failed one afternoon, a drone meant to demonstrate new security technology. It fell from the air and shattered into pieces during a live test. Everyone panicked, but Ethan stood still, watching it spin helplessly before crashing. He couldn't explain why it hit him so hard. The sight of something designed to stay steady falling apart felt too familiar. Later that night, he replayed the footage over and over on his laptop, hearing the small motor whine like a warning he didn't understand yet. It felt like the sound of failure. That failure triggered a chain reaction. Clients called to complain, deadlines slipped, and morale dropped. Ethan became unpredictable in meetings, snapping at people for small mistakes. Mark kept his distance, speaking less, avoiding eye contact. It hurt more than any argument. Ethan started checking Mark's schedule through the company system, pretending it was work-related. Every time he saw Mark's name on another team's list, something ugly twisted in his chest. He knew it was wrong, but the fear of losing him had already taken control. Love had turned into obsession. At home, Claire grew restless. She felt the tension building even though Ethan barely spoke anymore. The house felt colder, quieter, like it was waiting for something to break. She found old receipts for dinners Ethan never mentioned and a new cologne he never wore around her. Then she saw the birthday cake again, still sitting untouched. She placed it on the table, stared at the label with Mark's name, and understood what her instincts had been trying to tell her. For now, she said nothing, but her silence turned into quiet calculation. Ethan knew Claire was suspicious, but he underestimated her. He believed his charm could cover anything. He started acting overly kind, hoping it would calm her, but his efforts only made her watch closer. Every word he spoke sounded rehearsed. Every move he made seemed forced. At the office, Ethan couldn't stop thinking about what Claire might discover next. His mind was split, half at work, half guarding secrets. In trying to protect everything, he was actually inviting disaster. Every lie now felt heavier, like a stone tied to his chest. Mark began to fade from Ethan's life slowly, in ways that were almost invisible at first. He stopped answering late-night calls, skipped coffee breaks, and requested different project assignments. Ethan felt the distance like a wound. Instead of letting go, he tried to pull him back with guilt and favors. He promoted Mark without warning, claiming it was for talent recognition. It only made things worse. Mark looked uncomfortable, trapped between gratitude and fear. Ethan thought he was saving their connection, but in reality, he was suffocating it without realizing. The promotion created more pressure at work. People gossiped about favoritism and secret reasons behind the decision. Mark's coworkers treated him differently, whispering whenever he walked by. Ethan noticed and grew defensive, insisting Mark earned it. He began spending long hours checking everyone's reports, trying to control every narrative. He didn't see that paranoia was already showing in his behavior. He felt betrayed by the world, convinced no one understood what he was fighting for. The truth was he didn't even understand it himself anymore. It was no longer love, just fear. Ethan started tracking Mark's movements like it was part of work. He memorized his schedule, checked his calendar, and sometimes drove by his apartment under the excuse of just passing through. He hated himself for it but couldn't stop. The thought of Mark talking to someone else filled him with anger he didn't recognize. At night he stared at the ceiling, replaying old moments like reruns of a show he couldn't stop watching. He thought about how simple it had been at first, just two people talking, and how far it had gone now. One weekend, Ethan saw photos on social media, Mark at dinner with a new friend. It was innocent, but to Ethan it felt like betrayal. The image burned in his mind. He zoomed in, staring at Mark's smile, trying to guess what he was thinking. That night, Ethan sent a message he never should have sent, full of jealousy and pain. He deleted it seconds later but couldn't undo what he felt. The next day, when Mark came to work, Ethan avoided him entirely, acting calm while his thoughts screamed. The tension between them became obvious. Meetings felt heavy, their silence noticeable. Employees picked up on it, though no one dared to say anything. Ethan's assistant once caught him staring at Mark's desk for minutes without moving. The company's energy began to shift. The focus on innovation replaced by unease. Ethan blamed everyone else for distraction, but the real problem sat in his reflection. Every time he looked at himself, he saw a stranger with tired eyes. The harder he tried to hide it, the more cracks appeared in his carefully built image. Ethan started drinking after hours, something he hadn't done in years. He'd sit alone in his office, staring at the failed drone prototype on his desk. Sometimes he'd turn it on just to hear the faint buzzing sound, like an echo of what he lost. It reminded him of the night things started falling apart, when control slipped through his hands. He replayed old memories with Mark in his head, trying to rewrite them into something pure. But each time he tried, guilt drowned out the warmth. Love had turned into noise. He began seeing signs in everything. A headline about betrayal, a random song about secrets. Even the hum of the city outside his office felt like it was mocking him. His world became a maze of reminders he couldn't escape. The more he tried to work, the more distracted he became. He made calls without remembering why. He approved budgets without reading them. His assistant noticed but said nothing. Everyone was afraid of him now. Not because of his power, but because he looked like a man on the edge of breaking. Ethan didn't realize that his own obsession was visible to everyone around him. The people who once respected him now avoided eye contact. Mark avoided being in the same room, while Claire watched from home like someone studying a storm. Ethan kept telling himself he had things under control, but every word he spoke contradicted that. He was slipping deeper into a spiral of fear, love, and anger. The same focus that once built his empire now fueled his downfall, and he couldn't even see it happening until it was too late. Desperate to fix things, Ethan came up with an idea. He offered Mark full creative control over the company's next big project. A skyscraper meant to define their legacy. It was a move that shocked everyone. He said it was for innovation, but everyone could see it was personal. Ethan believed that giving Mark power would bind them again. But Mark accepted only because it seemed like a way to end the tension quietly. Neither realized the decision would pull them both toward a breaking point they couldn't come back from. The skyscraper project became Ethan's obsession. He micromanaged every detail, from design sketches to lighting choices. He'd call Mark late at night about minor edits, pretending it was about deadlines. Mark grew tired but stayed polite, afraid of what would happen if he resisted too hard. The building, meant to be a symbol of innovation, became a mirror of Ethan's instability. Every beam and glass panel represented the illusion of perfection he could no longer hold together. Behind closed doors he was falling apart piece by piece, though no one dared to say it. Ethan's board started noticing changes. Reports were late, budgets misaligned, and communication fell apart. They questioned his leadership in private meetings. Ethan responded with charm and denial, pretending everything was fine, but his eyes gave him away. Restless, sleepless, haunted. He spent nights at the office, sleeping on the couch, surrounded by blueprints and empty bottles. When the janitor entered early mornings, Ethan pretended to be working. He was terrified of being alone with his thoughts, so he buried himself under noise, even if it meant destroying what was left of his sanity. He stopped visiting home completely. Claire called a few times, then gave up. She knew something deeper than infidelity was happening now. Something darker. Ethan, meanwhile, convinced himself he was protecting her from truth. He saw himself as a man torn by love and duty, though he was the one causing all the pain. Mark tried to distance himself by taking business trips. Ethan followed every move through internal updates. The more Mark tried to escape, the tighter Ethan's grip became. He didn't see boundaries anymore. Everything blurred between love and possession. The company's annual conference arrived. and Ethan stood on stage pretending everything was fine. Cameras flashed. People clapped. But his voice trembled slightly when he mentioned the skyscraper. Mark was in the audience, avoiding eye contact. Afterward, reporters praised the company's growth but whispered about Ethan's detached tone. Backstage, Ethan smiled for photos, but as soon as the lights turned off, he froze in exhaustion. The applause had become meaningless. He realized success didn't make him happy anymore. Only control did, and he was losing that faster than he could rebuild it. At home, Claire quietly started her own investigation. She looked through old messages, phone logs, and credit card statements. The pattern was clear. Dinners, hotels, strange purchases tied to the same dates. Her heart broke, but her anger was colder now. She didn't want revenge yet. She wanted proof. Ethan had always underestimated her intelligence, and that was his biggest mistake. She planned to wait for the right time, to watch how far he would go before she revealed what she already knew. Silence became her sharpest weapon. Ethan's mind drifted between business and obsession. He'd be in a meeting discussing construction budgets and suddenly imagine Mark's voice or laugh. The smallest reminder, a word, a color, even a scent, brought everything flooding back. He tried meditation, new schedules, even alcohol to quiet his thoughts, but nothing worked. The skyscraper became more than a project. It was his escape. He poured all his energy into it, as if building higher walls could block the chaos inside him. But the higher he built, the closer he came to falling. He avoided everyone except Mark. Whenever their paths crossed, Ethan felt the same electricity mixed with guilt and frustration. Mark's politeness hurt more than anger would have. Ethan tried to act professional, but every glance felt loaded with history. At night, he dreamed about conversations they never had, moments that never happened. Each morning, those dreams felt more real than his waking life. He told himself love was supposed to hurt, that this pain meant it was real. He never realized that what he felt wasn't love anymore. It was obsession disguised as longing. One rainy night, the office lost power during a thunderstorm. The city outside went dark except for distant lightning flashing across the windows. Ethan stood by the balcony, listening to the quiet hum of emergency lights. The air smelled of rain and metal. For a moment, he felt peace. No emails, no voices, no judgment, just the dark. Then a memory surfaced, of the first night he and Mark crossed the line. It came back with painful clarity. By the time the power returned, Ethan's eyes were wet, though he didn't know why. He looked around the office after the lights came back and saw small objects scattered across his desk. Files, blueprints, the broken drone. Among them was something new, a red thread tied loosely around one of his pens. He froze. It was the same thread Mark used in his blueprints, a small trick for color-coding designs. Ethan didn't know if Mark had left it there intentionally or not, but it felt like a sign. He picked it up carefully, winding it around his finger until it left a small red mark on his skin. Ethan kept the red thread in his pocket from that night onward. It became his reminder of connection, proof that the love he ruined had once been real. Every time fear rose inside him, he'd touch the thread and feel calmer for a moment. He didn't realize he was turning it into a chain instead of a symbol. It tied him to something gone. People at work noticed his distraction. He'd pause mid-sentence or smile at nothing. He told them it was stress. But deep down, Ethan knew he was unraveling slowly. Outside the company, whispers started spreading. Employees mentioned Ethan's strange behavior to higher-ups. Some claimed he was unstable. Others said he was under pressure. The board began quietly reviewing his projects, worried about investor trust. Ethan ignored all of it, convinced that as long as he had Mark, nothing else mattered. But Mark barely spoke to him now, keeping interactions short and formal. The distance only made Ethan's emotions stronger. He mistook rejection for mystery, silence for love. He didn't see that the walls closing in were of his own making. Days after the blackout, Ethan couldn't stop thinking about the red thread. He checked his desk every morning, wondering if someone saw him take it. The thought haunted him. To calm himself, he began tying small knots into the thread, pretending each knot represented control. But the more he tied, the more tangled it became. It looked messy, chaotic. Exactly like his life. He kept it hidden in his jacket pocket, close to his heart, as if it could hold his sanity together. It didn't. It only reminded him of everything slipping away. He told himself the red thread meant Mark still cared. It became proof that the connection wasn't one-sided, even though deep down he knew it probably was. Mark had barely spoken to him since that night. Ethan started reading into every glance, every half-smile, every word Mark said in meetings. It all became evidence of love in his mind. He was rewriting reality just to survive it. The obsession no longer felt like choice or romance. It was a need, the kind that makes people destroy everything just to feel something again. Ethan's assistant noticed his declining focus. Reports piled up. Contracts went unsigned, and the skyscraper project fell behind schedule. Ethan dismissed every concern with irritation. He believed he was still in control, but every action showed otherwise. He spent long hours walking aimlessly through the office halls, his reflection in glass walls following him like a ghost. Employees whispered about his odd behavior, the way he mumbled under his breath, or stared at empty chairs as if someone invisible sat there. The red thread burned against his pocket like a secret he couldn't release. Claire's investigation reached a turning point. The private investigator she hired found travel receipts, hotel bookings, and transfers linking Ethan and Mark. It was enough proof to end everything. But Claire didn't rush to expose him. She wanted to understand what had happened to the man she once loved. Looking at the photos and records, she didn't see passion, she saw obsession. She felt disgust, sadness, and pity all at once. She realized Ethan wasn't just unfaithful, he was unraveling. And soon his destruction would not just hurt her, it would destroy them all. At the office, tension reached a peak. Mark avoided Ethan completely now, sending assistants to meetings and replying to emails with short professional notes. Ethan grew furious but masked it under false politeness. He told his team that Mark was overloaded with work, but everyone sensed something deeper. Ethan's anger simmered beneath the surface. He started making careless decisions that affected the whole company. The board grew concerned, and whispers reached investors. Ethan didn't care. He was too busy trying to control a man who no longer wanted to be controlled. One evening, Claire finally confronted Ethan. She walked into his office unannounced, placed the investigator's folder on his desk, and waited. Ethan's face went pale. She didn't shout or cry, she simply said she knew. He tried to deny it, fumbling with excuses, but she didn't listen. Her silence was worse than anger. It exposed how powerless he had become. For the first time, Ethan realized he couldn't manipulate his way out of this. Claire left without another word, leaving him surrounded by the physical proof of every lie he had ever told. After Claire left, Ethan sat in his office for hours. The city lights blinked outside like signals he couldn't read. He opened the folder, staring at the photos. Hotel receipts, emails, a snapshot of him and Mark at a restaurant. The reality of it all hit him like a wave. He had built his life on control, but love had turned him into a fool. Yet even as shame burned through him, a darker thought followed. If Claire knew, maybe soon everyone else would too. Panic replaced guilt, and the obsession came roaring back. Ethan called Mark to his office the next morning. Mark looked nervous, sensing trouble. Ethan told him to stay quiet about everything, claiming it would protect them both. Mark refused, saying he wanted nothing to do with the lies anymore. That word, lies, cut deep. Ethan's anger exploded. He warned Mark that if he left the project, he'd expose private details that could ruin him. Mark froze, realizing how far Ethan had fallen. The man who once felt like a partner now looked like a threat. Ethan didn't notice. He was too far gone. After that day, Mark avoided the office entirely. He sent his resignation quietly through email, but Ethan intercepted it before anyone saw. He deleted it, pretending it never existed. The desperation showed in everything he did. He called Mark repeatedly, left voicemails, and waited outside his apartment. Each time, Mark ignored him, pushing him further into madness. Ethan began to believe the only way to fix things was to make Mark see what he'd destroyed. Love in Ethan's mind had twisted into punishment. It was no longer about care, only about control. That night, the rain fell harder than usual. Ethan sat in the break room, alone, staring through the glass as water streaked down the windows. The city outside looked blurred, distant, unreachable. He thought about everything he'd lost: Claire's trust, Mark's affection, his company's respect. For a brief moment, he felt something strange, calm. Maybe it was acceptance, or maybe just exhaustion. He whispered to himself that he could still fix it all, but deep down he knew he was only lying again, trapped in the same cycle that had brought him here. By morning, Ethan's calm had turned into cold focus. He arrived early, pretending nothing had happened. He ordered his staff to proceed with the skyscraper designs despite missing approvals. He told them it would make headlines, that success would silence rumors. No one believed him, but they followed orders anyway. Behind his smile, his eyes looked hollow. Ethan wasn't chasing progress anymore. He was chasing redemption that didn't exist. The more he pushed, the more isolated he became. It was no longer about love or work. It was about proving he hadn't lost control. Rumors spread fast. Employees whispered about strange late-night meetings, broken relationships, and missing emails. Someone anonymously reported concerns about Ethan's mental state to the board. The directors met in secret to discuss replacing him temporarily. Ethan found out through his assistant and felt betrayed by everyone. He believed Mark had influenced them. The paranoia took over. He began recording conversations, locking his files, and installing cameras in his own office. To him, everyone was an enemy now. He told himself it was just smart leadership, but it was fear, plain and simple, eating him alive. Mark tried once more to speak with Ethan, hoping to end things peacefully. Ethan twisted his words, turning the conversation into another plea for love. When Mark insisted on leaving, Ethan's face changed. Calm one moment, furious the next. He told Mark that walking away would be a mistake, that they were bound by more than a project. Mark left without another word, and Ethan stood there trembling, caught between heartbreak and rage. He couldn't accept that it was over. To him, the end of this relationship meant the end of himself. Ethan stopped sleeping altogether. His nights were filled with pacing, typing meaningless emails, and rewatching old footage of him and Mark at work events. He zoomed in on moments where they smiled, convincing himself there was still something there. Each click made the illusion stronger. He felt both powerful and desperate, like someone holding sand that kept slipping through his fingers. The more he tried to hold on, the faster everything fell apart. By dawn, he'd look in the mirror and not recognize the man staring back at him anymore. One evening, Claire followed Mark after work. She had seen too much to stay quiet, but she wanted proof of what Ethan was still doing. Mark walked quickly, tense, looking over his shoulder. When he stopped at a hotel parking lot, she saw Ethan's car already waiting there. Her stomach dropped. She stayed hidden, watching from her car as the two men stood close, talking with visible tension. Claire realized it wasn't love anymore. It was fear. When Ethan stepped closer and Mark flinched, she knew this story would not end quietly. The confrontation between Ethan and Mark was brief but heavy. Mark said he wanted no part of Ethan's chaos anymore. Ethan begged, then threatened, switching between love and control in seconds. Mark walked away, leaving Ethan standing in the rain. Watching him disappear into the distance, Ethan felt an emptiness that scared him. He thought losing Mark would kill him, but it didn't. It just left him hollow. He drove home soaked, gripping the steering wheel so tight his hands hurt. realizing he had turned everything he touched into ruin. When Ethan returned home, Claire was waiting. She didn't yell or cry this time. She simply said she was leaving, and that the lawyer would contact him soon. Her calmness broke him more than anger ever could. Ethan tried to explain, to make her see that he had been lost, but she looked at him like a stranger. She picked up her bag and walked out without another word. The door closed softly behind her, and the silence that followed was unbearable. It was the first time Ethan truly felt completely alone. He sat on the living room floor for hours after Claire left. Empty glasses surrounded him. Old files scattered like debris from a storm. The house felt foreign, too big, too quiet. He thought about calling Mark but didn't. Instead, he replayed every mistake in his head, wondering when exactly love had turned into destruction. He told himself he didn't mean to hurt anyone, that all he wanted was connection. But connection built on lies can't survive. It always collapses. And now he was standing in the ruins of everything he once cared about. In the following days, Ethan's condition worsened. He stopped showing up to half his meetings. The board threatened to suspend him, but he ignored their calls. He started sending emails to Mark late at night. Long, rambling messages full of apologies, memories, and desperation. He never sent them, saving them all in a folder labeled for later. It became his new obsession. Each message felt like talking to a ghost. They were confessions meant for someone who no longer wanted to listen, but he couldn't stop writing them anyway. Claire moved out completely, leaving behind only a few boxes. Ethan noticed one small thing on the kitchen counter, a broken photo frame of them smiling years ago. He stared at it for a long time, trying to remember who that man was. The picture showed someone calm, proud, happy. Now he couldn't find any trace of that person in himself. He threw the frame away but kept the photo in his wallet. Maybe out of habit, maybe guilt. It didn't matter. He just couldn't bear to lose one more piece of his old life. At work, Ethan became almost unrecognizable. He started showing up in wrinkled suits, unshaven, eyes red from sleepless nights. His assistant avoided him. The team whispered when he walked by. He stopped caring about numbers or clients. The skyscraper project, once his greatest vision, now stood half-finished, like a reflection of his own mind. Late at night, he sat at his desk writing emails to Mark that no one would ever see. Dozens of them filled his drafts folder, each one a mix of confession, regret, and silent pleading for forgiveness. Claire's lawyer called to finalize the divorce. The news spread quietly among the company's upper circle. People pretended not to know, but gossip traveled fast. Ethan felt humiliated. He blamed Mark for everything. For the loss, for the shame, for the unraveling of his life. That anger soon replaced all other feelings. It gave him something to hold on to. The love that had once fueled him now burned as resentment. He told himself Mark had ruined him, refusing to admit that he had done it to himself. It was easier that way. He moved into his office permanently, claiming it was for work, but it was really because he couldn't face the empty house. He slept on the couch, showered in the gym downstairs, and ordered food in. The red thread never left his pocket. It had frayed slightly, but he still kept it close, rubbing it between his fingers when panic hit. It had become a nervous habit. Nights blurred into mornings. He existed in the same loop. Guilt, work, fear, and loneliness, unable to stop, unable to start over. Everything felt mechanical now. His employees noticed the change. The man who once demanded excellence now sat staring at his desk for hours. When they approached him, he pretended to be busy. He gave vague answers, signed papers without reading them, and mumbled apologies when he forgot people's names. He was a shadow of the leader he used to be. Some pitied him, others just wanted him gone. The company kept functioning out of habit, not respect. Meanwhile, Ethan clung to the idea that if Mark just forgave him, everything would return to normal again. One night, after everyone had left, Ethan heated a bowl of instant noodles in the office microwave. He sat at his desk under the dim light. the red thread lying beside his laptop. In the corner of the fridge sat that same old birthday cake, untouched since the day he bought it. He looked at it and laughed quietly, realizing how something so small had become the symbol of everything lost. For the first time he felt tired. Not angry, not guilty, just tired. He didn't know it, but the worst was still ahead. A few weeks later, Ethan saw something online that shattered the fragile calm he had built. Mark had posted a photo with someone new. A man smiling beside him at a restaurant. It wasn't romantic in any obvious way, but to Ethan, it felt like betrayal. He stared at the image for hours, zooming in on every detail, convincing himself it meant more than it did. That night, he didn't sleep. The jealousy consumed him, twisting into something darker. He wasn't thinking about love anymore. He was thinking about control and revenge. Ethan's mind became a storm. He couldn't stop picturing Mark with someone else. Every thought felt like fire under his skin. He told himself he needed closure, one final meeting to set things right. But underneath that lie was something else, the desire to make Mark feel the same pain he felt. He rehearsed what he'd say, pacing in front of the mirror, convincing himself he just wanted honesty. But his reflection showed something different. A man who had crossed every moral line and was now standing at the edge of madness. He decided to call Mark, pretending it was about work. His voice sounded calm, professional, even friendly. Mark hesitated but agreed to meet the next evening at the office to review project files. Ethan hung up, his heart racing. He felt relief, excitement, fear, all mixed into one unbearable rush. He told himself this would fix everything, that they could talk like adults and move on. But deep down he knew he wasn't ready to let go. He didn't want peace. He wanted Mark to understand the pain he had caused. The next evening, Ethan prepared the office like he was hosting a performance. He cleaned his desk, dimmed the lights, and poured 2 glasses of whiskey. The city outside glowed faintly under the rain. He rehearsed what he would say one last time, pacing between the window and the desk. Every sound made him flinch. The elevator, the thunder, even his own heartbeat. When Mark finally knocked on the door, Ethan's hands trembled. He told himself to stay calm, but calmness was long gone. Everything inside him was ready to break. Mark entered quietly, holding the project folder. The air between them felt thick, heavy with things unsaid. Ethan thanked him for coming, pretending to be calm. They spoke about the project for a few minutes, but the tension was unbearable. Then Ethan shifted the topic to them. The past, the silence, the new person in Mark's life. Mark's expression hardened. He said they needed to end all contact, that it was time to move on. Those words pierced through Ethan's chest like a blade. For him it wasn't closure, it was rejection. Ethan's control cracked instantly. He accused Mark of lying, of pretending to care. Mark tried to leave, but Ethan blocked the door. The argument grew louder, words turning sharp and hateful. Ethan's emotions twisted between rage and heartbreak. When Mark tried to push past him, Ethan grabbed his arm, pleading 1 second and shouting the next. The struggle was brief but violent. Mark lost his balance, hitting his head on the edge of the desk before falling hard to the floor. The room went silent. Ethan froze, his breath caught somewhere between disbelief and horror. He dropped to his knees beside Mark, shaking him, begging him to wake up. But Mark didn't move. Blood trickled slowly across the floor. Ethan's heart pounded as reality hit. It wasn't an argument anymore. It was something irreversible. He backed away, trembling, whispering that it was an accident. His hands were shaking so badly that he could barely dial his phone, but he didn't call for help. Instead, his mind jumped to survival. Within seconds, fear replaced guilt, and he began thinking of ways to cover what had just happened. Ethan stumbled around the room, panicking. His thoughts blurred together. He locked the door, wiped surfaces, and tried to make sense of what he'd done. He deleted messages, shut off security cameras, and threw away the glasses of whiskey. His brain moved faster than reason. He kept saying to himself that it wasn't murder, that Mark had fallen. But every time he looked at the still figure on the floor, the truth screamed louder. The red thread slipped from his pocket, landing near Mark's hand, like a cruel reminder of their bond. He forced himself to act logical. He dragged the body closer to the desk, placing papers around it to make it look like a robbery gone wrong. He smashed his own phone against the wall to make it seem like a struggle. His breathing was uneven, chest tight with panic. The sound of the rain outside felt deafening. He looked around the office, his empire now turned into a crime scene. He whispered to himself that he could fix it, that no one had to know. But even he didn't believe that anymore. When he finally stepped back, the office looked almost normal. Except for one thing: the silence. The kind of silence that follows disaster. Ethan stared at the mess he had created, waiting for reality to reset, for someone to wake him from the nightmare. But nothing changed. Mark was gone, and the weight of it pressed down on him like a mountain. He walked to the window, staring at the glowing city below. Everything still looked calm out there, unaware that inside this room, a life had just ended. Hours passed before Ethan dared to leave. He washed his hands in the restroom, scrubbing until his skin turned red. In the mirror, he didn't see a CEO anymore. He saw a stranger. Eyes hollow, face pale, soul gone. He whispered that it was an accident, repeating it until it almost sounded true. He put on his coat and left the office, locking the door behind him as if that would keep the truth inside. But the truth was already following him, sitting quietly in the back of his mind. The next morning, the cleaning staff found Mark's body. Police arrived within minutes. The building was sealed off, yellow tape, marking the place Ethan once called home. News spread quickly. By the time Ethan reached his office, reporters were already outside. He acted shocked, pretending to know nothing. The officers asked routine questions, but his answers trembled slightly. He could tell they noticed. He told himself to stay calm, that there was no proof. But when they mentioned checking the security footage, his heart nearly stopped. He had forgotten one critical thing. There had been a backup server in the IT room that saved footage automatically. Ethan hadn't known about it. As investigators reviewed files, his anxiety grew unbearable. He returned home and tore through drawers, trying to destroy anything that could connect them. He deleted old emails, messages, even the unsent drafts. But it was useless. Every trace left behind was another thread pulling him closer to exposure. The sound of sirens outside made him jump every time. He began to see Mark's reflection in windows, shadows, even mirrors haunting him everywhere he looked. Sleep vanished completely. Ethan saw flashes of the night in his dreams. The sound of the fall, the blood, the silence afterward. He couldn't tell what was real anymore. He started talking to Mark as if he were still alive, apologizing, justifying, blaming. His mind played tricks on him. Once he thought he saw the red thread tied around his wrist in the mirror, though it wasn't really there. It terrified him, but he also couldn't look away. He was no longer afraid of punishment. He was afraid of living with himself. One night he sat in the restroom again, the same one where he had washed his hands after the fall. He stared at his reflection for a long time, whispering that everything was fine. The air felt heavy and cold. The sound of dripping water from a leaky faucet echoed like a clock counting down. For the first time he understood that nothing could erase what he had done. He had built his life on control, but in the end all it had brought him was destruction. He looked broken, and this time he didn't look away. The investigation grew stronger. Detectives collected hard drives, interviewed employees, and examined building access logs. Ethan kept showing up to work, pretending everything was normal. But the questions became sharper, more pointed. They knew he had been in the building that night. The board suspended him indefinitely, citing mental health concerns. His empire began to collapse, shares dropping, trust disappearing. The same people who once praised him now avoided his name. He stayed in his penthouse, blinds closed, whispering to himself that no one could ever prove anything. But deep down, he knew. Claire saw the news on television. She froze as she heard the words "company executive found dead." She didn't need details. Her body already knew the truth. Later that night, she received a call from the police, asking about Ethan's behavior. She answered calmly, telling them about his erratic moods, his jealousy, and the affair she had discovered. When she hung up, she sat in silence for a long time. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the strange feeling of closure mixed with grief. It was the ending she never wanted but expected. The police found deleted emails that hinted at Ethan and Mark's relationship. It wasn't direct proof, but it was enough to deepen suspicion. They questioned Ethan again, this time more aggressively. He maintained his innocence, saying Mark had left angry and that he'd found out about his death later. The detectives didn't believe him, but they let him go. For now. As he walked out of the station, flashlights and cameras followed. His name was already trending online. His reputation, once spotless, was now stained permanently by whispers of scandal and murder. Ethan's world shrank to 4 walls. He barely left the apartment, surviving on takeout and coffee. He turned off his phone, stopped reading the news, and avoided mirrors. But silence brought no comfort. He started hearing faint sounds. A bell, a voice, a heartbeat that wasn't his. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, he thought he heard Mark whisper his name. He told himself it was guilt, nothing more, but it felt real. The same control that once made him powerful was now gone, replaced with fear he couldn't reason with. He opened his laptop one morning and saw headlines calling him the fallen CEO. Articles recounted his success, his arrogance, and his downfall. Each one painted him as a villain. He wanted to shout that it wasn't like that he had loved Mark, that it had been an accident. But there was no one left to listen. The world had moved on, leaving him trapped in the ruins of his choices. The red thread still lay on his desk, frayed and dirty. He couldn't throw it away, yet he couldn't bear to touch it either. Detectives eventually recovered the missing backup footage. They didn't release details to the public, but Ethan knew what it showed. That was the day everything changed. They came to his apartment again, this time with quiet confidence. He tried to act calm, offering coffee, pretending ignorance, but his hands shook. They told him the footage proved he had been alone with Mark. He denied it weakly. After they left, Ethan sat in silence, staring at the wall. There was no escape left. The world was closing in, and for the first time he stopped running. That night, Ethan dreamed of the drone again. It hovered in front of him, shaking uncontrollably before crashing to the floor. In the dream, he reached for it, but it turned into the red thread coiling around his wrist. When he woke, sweat drenched his sheets. He felt trapped, suffocated by his own thoughts. Every sound in the apartment startled him. He couldn't tell if he was awake or still dreaming. Reality blurred completely. He had spent his life building walls to protect himself, but now those same walls had become his prison. The hallucinations grew worse. He saw Mark sitting on the couch, quiet and calm, the same way he used to be. Sometimes Ethan spoke to him, apologizing, crying, begging for forgiveness, but Mark never replied. When he blinked, the image disappeared, leaving only shadows. He stopped trusting his senses. He couldn't work, couldn't eat, couldn't think clearly. The only thing that felt real anymore was guilt, heavy and constant. It followed him like a shadow, whispering reminders of the life he destroyed. He started to believe this was his punishment, and he deserved it. The sound of rain returned one night, soft against the glass. Ethan stood by the window staring at the dark sky. The smell of wet asphalt reminded him of that blackout night, the one where it all started. He realized how every small choice had built up to this. A look, a message, a secret. Each one had pushed him closer to ruin. He thought about how easy it had been to hide lies, how good he had been at pretending. Now there was nothing left to hide behind, only silence and regret. Ethan's assistant called to tell him the police had officially reopened the case with new evidence. He barely reacted. His mind was already far from fear or panic. He knew it was over. He sat at his desk looking at the skyline, remembering the first time he'd met Mark. The laughter, the warmth, the sense of belonging. Then he looked at the red thread, still coiled on the desk like a piece of memory he couldn't escape. He realized the truth. Everything that bound him had also destroyed him. And now, it was time to face it. That night, Ethan couldn't stop hearing the sound of the malfunctioning drone in his head. It buzzed faintly, followed by the same crash that ended its flight. He realized the parallel. Something built to succeed had failed because of a single flaw in its design. That flaw was him. He had spent his life constructing perfect systems, perfect lies, perfect masks, yet they all broke under pressure. He saw clearly now that every piece of control he'd tried to maintain had only pushed him closer to collapse. There was no perfection left to chase. He spent the next morning pacing the apartment. His reflection in the glass doors followed him, mimicking his guilt. He thought about running away. New country, new name, but the idea felt meaningless. He had already been running all his life. For once he wanted to stop. He sat at the desk, opened his laptop and began typing. Words poured out, not excuses or lies this time, but the truth. It was messy, raw, and painful. The confession wasn't for the police or the public. It was for himself. A desperate attempt at redemption. By afternoon he had written pages. He described everything from the affair to the obsession, from the accident to the lies. He didn't try to justify anything. He just wanted someone to understand how love, guilt, and pride could twist a man into something unrecognizable. When he finished, his hands shook from exhaustion. For the first time in months, he felt strangely at peace. He printed the letter and sealed it in an envelope addressed to whoever still cares. It was his final attempt to tell the truth before the world decided for him. Later that day, he sat by the window watching rain streak across the glass. He remembered the concept of Sonder, that every person around him had a life as deep and complicated as his own. He had never truly believed that before. He had seen others as extensions of his story, not as their own. Maybe if he had understood sooner that Mark and Claire had worlds outside of him, none of this would have happened. It was too late now, but that realization, though painful, gave him a kind of quiet understanding. Police cars pulled up outside his building that evening. He saw their blue lights reflecting off the windows. He didn't panic this time. He expected them. He even felt relief. The knocking at his door echoed softly, not threatening but final. He thought about ignoring it, but he didn't. He turned off the lights, sat back down at his desk, and stared at the city one last time. He wasn't sure if what he felt was courage or surrender. Maybe it didn't matter anymore. Everything that needed to be said was already written. The police entered quietly, voices calm and steady. They told him he was under arrest, listing the charges with practiced detachment. Ethan nodded without arguing. He asked if he could grab something first, and they allowed it. He reached into the drawer and took out the red thread, winding it around his finger. It hurt, cutting slightly into his skin, but the sting grounded him. As they cuffed him, he looked around the apartment, realizing how empty it was. The silence that once haunted him now felt almost comforting, like a long overdue ending. At the station, reporters waited outside. Flashbulbs burst as officers guided Ethan through the crowd. He didn't look up. Questions filled the air. Did you kill him? Why did you do it? Was it jealousy? He said nothing. The words didn't matter anymore. The world had already chosen its version of truth. Inside the building, the officers took his statement, recorded his fingerprints, and escorted him to a holding cell. The walls were blank and gray. For the first time, Ethan had nowhere left to run, and strangely, that felt almost like peace. That night, he lay on the thin cot in his cell, staring at the ceiling. The fluorescent light buzzed softly, the same pitch as the drone from his memories. He closed his eyes and let the sound carry him backward to a time before all of this. He saw Mark laughing, Claire smiling, his company thriving. It was all so distant now, like a life lived by someone else. He realized that in chasing control he had never truly lived. For once he stopped fighting his thoughts and let the memories fade into silence. The following week, the footage from the backup server was released to the prosecutors. It clearly showed Ethan standing over Mark after the fall, frozen and doing nothing to help. The image spread across the internet within hours, confirming what most already believed. The narrative was complete. The brilliant CEO undone by obsession. Ethan didn't fight it. He didn't hire a new lawyer or issue statements. He simply sat through the trial, quiet, detached, accepting every accusation. He had stopped caring about reputation. What he wanted now was something simpler, an end to pretending. In court, Ethan watched as Mark's family sat in silence. Their faces were pale with grief. Claire didn't look at him once. He didn't blame her. When it was his turn to speak, he didn't offer excuses. He only said that love can't exist without honesty. And he had lost both. The judge said something about consequences and justice. But Ethan barely heard it. His thoughts were somewhere else. Not on punishment, but on memory. He knew that what haunted him most wasn't what he did, but the person he had become to do it. After the verdict, the news exploded again. Headlines called him every name possible: monster, narcissist, sociopath. People dissected his life online, turning his story into entertainment. Old employees gave interviews. Psychologists discussed his behavior on talk shows. He became a symbol of power gone wrong. But behind those labels was just a man who had made too many wrong choices, one after another, until there was no way back. He had turned his need for control into a weapon that destroyed everyone around him, including himself. That was the only truth left. Ethan's company removed his name from every document and replaced him on the board. The skyscraper project was frozen indefinitely. His empire, once worth millions, crumbled overnight. Sitting in his cell, he imagined the office lights turning off one by one, the walls growing darker. The empire he built on obsession had died the same way it was born, quietly under pressure with no one left to save it. He thought about how ironic it was that everything he had built for love had ended in loneliness. For the first time, he didn't resist the irony. Weeks passed. Ethan's daily routine became simple. Breakfast, silence, reflection. In the quiet moments he began to notice small things he had ignored before: the smell of soap, the sound of footsteps in the hallway, the color of morning light. He realized how little attention he had given to life itself. Everything had been a means to control or impress. Now, stripped of status and identity, he felt strangely human again. The guilt remained, but the noise had faded. It was just him now, raw and exposed, learning what peace really meant. One evening he received a small envelope during mail call. Inside was a printed photo, the red thread lying beside Mark's old sketches. There was no note, just the image. Ethan didn't know who sent it, but it didn't matter. He placed it carefully on his cell table and stared at it for a long time. The photo felt like closure, not forgiveness but acknowledgement. It reminded him that love, even when broken, still leaves traces behind. He folded it gently and kept it with him, not as punishment, but as a reminder of truth. He often wondered what would have happened if he had told the truth sooner, if he had let go before everything fell apart. But then he realized that people like him never let go easily. They grip until things break. He couldn't change that now. What he could do was face what remained. He stopped imagining a future and started living one day at a time. In the simplest way possible, he accepted that peace doesn't always come from being forgiven. Sometimes it comes from finally admitting what you are. If you've ever wondered how far someone can fall before finding peace, stay with me. The ending is almost here. The next morning, Ethan woke up early. The prison yard was quiet, the sky pale with dawn. He felt calm. He wrote a short letter addressed to the court, thanking them for treating him fairly. Then he wrote another note to Claire, not asking for forgiveness but wishing her freedom from everything his choices had caused. He sealed both letters and handed them to the guard. There was nothing else left to say. He returned to his cell, sat by the small window, and watched the light climb slowly across the walls. He thought about Mark one last time. Not the man he lost, but the person he had trapped in his own obsession. He realized love had never been about ownership or control. It was about freedom, something he had never given Mark or himself. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that comes from painful understanding. The sound of a bell from the nearby chapel drifted faintly through the walls. He closed his eyes and listened, letting it wash over him like a quiet confession that didn't need words anymore. That night, he couldn't sleep. The air felt thick and heavy. He stood at the small sink, staring at his reflection in the mirror. The man looking back wasn't the CEO anymore. Not even the lover or the liar, just a man stripped bare. He picked up the red thread from the shelf and wrapped it gently around his finger. The fibers were rough but real. It reminded him that everything fragile still has texture, still leaves marks. He didn't know why he kept it. Maybe because it was the last thing that made him feel human. When the guard came by for the evening check, Ethan was sitting at his desk, writing again. This time it wasn't confession or apology. It was reflection. He wrote about the weight of choice, about how easy it is to mistake love for control. He didn't write for anyone else. It was for him, to understand the story from start to finish, to finally see it without excuses. He wrote until his hand ached, then folded the paper carefully and placed it beside the thread. The truth, at last, was out of his system. Days turned into weeks, and Ethan adjusted to the rhythm of confinement. He became quieter, almost peaceful. The guards noticed his change. He no longer looked haunted. He read books from the small prison library, and spent hours in silence. The guilt never left him, but it stopped consuming him. It became a scar instead of an open wound. Every time he touched the red thread, he thought of the lesson it carried. That love without honesty becomes poison, and control without empathy always ends in destruction. He finally understood too late. One afternoon, an officer told him Claire had visited. She didn't speak much during the meeting. She looked older, sad but stronger. Ethan thanked her for coming, but she only nodded. He could tell she didn't hate him anymore, but she couldn't forgive him either. As she stood to leave, she placed a small folded photo on the table. It was the skyscraper Mark had designed, now completed and dedicated in his memory. Ethan stared at it silently. It was beautiful, alive and full of everything he had tried to destroy. After she left, Ethan held the photo for a long time. He traced the outlines of the building with his finger, realizing it wasn't just a structure, it was the closure everyone else had found. Claire had moved on, the company had rebuilt, and Mark's memory had become something good. Ethan felt no jealousy, only calm acceptance. He knew he would spend the rest of his life paying for what he'd done, but in that moment he was at peace with it. Some debts can't be erased, but they can be carried with dignity. As months passed, Ethan became known in the prison for helping others with legal letters and business forms. The irony wasn't lost on him. The man destroyed by control was now teaching others how to regain it. He never sought praise or sympathy. He worked quietly, finding meaning in small acts of clarity. His nights were still long, but they no longer hurt as much. Sometimes he'd hear the rain outside, and instead of guilt, it brought a sense of calm. He finally understood that pain can teach peace if you stop resisting it. One evening he watched the sunset through the narrow window of his cell. The sky turned orange, then pink, fading into gray. He thought about how the world keeps moving, no matter who falls behind. He wasn't bitter about it anymore. He found comfort in knowing that life continues, that Mark's name would live through the skyscraper and Claire would live free. Ethan had nothing left to prove or protect. For the first time in years he felt small, and that smallness brought peace. He didn't need control. He just needed stillness. That night, Ethan wrote one final line in his journal. Some cages are built by hands that only wanted to hold. He set the pen down, closed his eyes, and leaned back on his cot. The faint hum of the building surrounded him, steady and soft. He wasn't afraid anymore. The past had carved deep scars, but it had also stripped him down to truth. Love had turned into obsession, and obsession into ruin. Yet in the quiet after everything, he had finally found something resembling peace. Late one night, Ethan sat up, unable to sleep. The cell was dark except for a thin strip of moonlight on the floor. He looked at the red thread on his desk, now faded and frayed. He picked it up, feeling the roughness between his fingers. It had once symbolized obsession, but now it felt like closure. He tied it around the handle of his mug, leaving it behind intentionally. It wasn't his burden anymore. For the first time, he didn't feel the need to keep a reminder of the pain he'd caused. He lay back on the cot and stared at the ceiling, thinking about the people he had hurt. He pictured Mark's calm smile, Claire's silent strength, and even his employees who once looked up to him. For years he had been so afraid of being seen as weak that he had built his life on lies. But weakness, he realized, wasn't what destroyed him. Denial did. The truth, however painful, had finally set him free. He felt lighter, like something heavy had finally lifted off his chest after years of silent pressure. The next morning, the guards unlocked the doors for the daily yard walk. Ethan stepped outside and breathed in the cool air. The world felt fresh again. The sound of birds, the warmth of sunlight, the rhythm of footsteps on gravel. He hadn't noticed simple things like this in years. As he walked, he thought about how small the world had become, yet how peaceful it felt. He didn't belong to success anymore, or reputation, or control. He was just another man, living one quiet morning at a time, finally at peace. Months passed quietly. Ethan spent his days helping in the prison library, organizing books and reading to inmates who couldn't read themselves. He found purpose in silence, a kind he had never known before. One afternoon, a young inmate asked him how someone like him had ended up here. Ethan simply replied that he once mistook control for love and learned the difference too late. The boy nodded, maybe understanding, maybe not. But for Ethan, saying it out loud felt like release, a truth finally spoken, without fear or shame. Seasons changed, and time moved gently. One morning, Ethan was called to the warden's office. He had received a letter from a foundation. The skyscraper Mark designed had been completed and renamed the Cole Tower, dedicated to both Mark and Ethan for their original collaboration. The letter said it stood as a reminder that creation and destruction often come from the same hands. Ethan read it 3 times, tears filling his eyes. It was the first time in years anyone had spoken his name with something other than hatred. It felt strange, but right. That evening, he asked the warden if he could see a photo of the tower. They printed one for him. A tall, shining structure reflecting the evening sun. Ethan stared at it for a long time. The building was beautiful, stronger than anything he had ever built alone. It carried both their names, both their stories. He placed the photo on his cell wall, not as pride, but as acceptance. Mark's dream had survived, even if he hadn't. Ethan whispered a quiet thank you, knowing this was the closest he'd ever come to forgiveness. The years went by, and Ethan's hair turned gray. The world outside changed, but he remained where he was, living quietly. Other inmates came and went, but Ethan stayed constant, patient, calm, almost like a teacher. His presence brought a strange steadiness to the place. The guards respected him. The younger men listened to him. He had once been known for power. Now he was known for peace. Every time he thought of Mark, he hoped that somewhere, somehow, his spirit knew that the man who ruined everything had finally learned remorse. One night, heavy rain fell over the prison. Ethan sat by his window, watching lightning flicker in the distance. The smell of rain on hot asphalt filled the air, the same scent that had haunted him for years. But this time it didn't bring guilt. It brought memory, soft and distant, like a life lived long ago. He smiled faintly. The same storm that once started his downfall now felt like renewal. He whispered that maybe in another life things could have been different. And for the first time, he truly believed it. He fell asleep listening to the rain, and for the first time in years he dreamed without fear. He dreamed of walking through a field at sunrise. No walls, no bars, no weight of guilt. Mark was there too. Distant, but smiling, nodding in quiet understanding. There were no words, no anger, just calm. When Ethan woke, tears rested on his cheeks, but they weren't from sadness, they were from peace. The kind that doesn't erase pain, but transforms it into something bearable. He finally understood that forgiveness doesn't erase the past, it redeems the present. The next morning, Ethan didn't join the others in the yard. The guard found him sitting upright on his cot. His journal open beside him, a faint smile still on his face. He had passed in his sleep, quietly, without struggle. The red thread was still tied to the mug handle, untouched. The journal's final page held a single sentence: "Peace is not given, it's earned through truth." The guards read it in silence, feeling a strange heaviness in the air. The man who once controlled everything had left quietly, finally letting go. News of his death spread quietly. The media mentioned it briefly, calling him the disgraced CEO, but most people had already moved on. Only Claire attended the small memorial the prison held. She placed a folded photo of the skyscraper beside his ashes, whispering something no one else could hear. When she left, she didn't cry. Instead, she looked up at the sky, thinking about how complicated love and forgiveness truly are. She wasn't angry anymore. She just hoped that wherever Ethan was, he had finally found the peace he spent his life chasing. Months later, Claire visited the Cole Tower for the first time. The lobby was filled with light, the walls lined with art that told the story of creation and redemption. A plaque near the entrance read, "For those who learn too late that love and control are never the same." She stood there for a while, running her hand over the engraved letters. It felt strange to see both their names together again, but it also felt right. The building stood as proof that even broken stories could leave behind something worth remembering. Outside, rain began to fall again, light and steady. Claire walked to the glass doors, watching the city blur under the downpour. For a moment she thought she saw Ethan's reflection beside hers. Older, calmer, smiling. It felt like his quiet way of saying goodbye. She didn't move, just nodded softly, letting the thought stay for a heartbeat before it faded. When she stepped outside, the rain didn't feel cold. It felt cleansing, as if the city itself was washing away the last traces of the pain that had lingered too long. Inside the tower's top floor, a small exhibit displayed Mark's original blueprints. Among them was the sketch of the red thread tied around the building's design, a symbol of connection that had started everything. The curator explained that the thread represented how fragile bonds can be, yet how strong they become when stretched by truth. Visitors stood quietly, moved without knowing the full story. Somewhere between tragedy and creation, the memory of two men, one who built and one who destroyed, had merged into something that still inspired others. Claire left the tower and walked down the busy street. The world had moved on, but she carried their memories gently, without bitterness. Life had been cruel, but it had also taught her strength. She stopped by a small park, watching children play in the rain, laughter echoing across puddles. For the first time in years, she smiled fully. The past no longer hurt, it had simply become part of her. Everyone had lost something, but in that loss they had also found meaning. Maybe that was the closest thing to redemption anyone gets. Years later, the Cole Tower became a landmark in the city, not for its beauty alone, but for the story behind it. People who knew whispered about the affair, the obsession, and the fall that followed, but most saw it as a monument to change. The tower's light shone differently at night, warm and steady, a symbol of what happens when broken things are rebuilt with honesty. Somewhere beyond memory, Ethan's story stopped being a scandal and became a quiet reminder that even tragedy can leave behind something worth understanding. The company that once belonged to Ethan thrived under new leadership. The culture changed completely. More open, kinder, less about perfection, and more about people. Every new employee learned the story of the skyscraper during orientation. It wasn't told as gossip but as a lesson about power, love, and ego. Ethan's name was mentioned not to shame him, but to remind them how dangerous ambition without empathy can be. Even in death he continued to teach, in the way only mistakes can, silently but powerfully through the echoes they leave behind. In time, Claire grew old and retired quietly by the sea. She lived in a small house overlooking the water, far from the city that had once been her entire world. Some nights, she sat by the window listening to waves crash, thinking of Mark and Ethan. Their story had shaped her life, not with joy but with perspective. She had learned that forgiveness doesn't erase pain. It simply makes room for peace. She whispered their names sometimes, not out of grief, but gratitude, for lessons learned through heartbreak and healing. One evening, as the sun dipped into the horizon, Claire received a small package in the mail. Inside was a folded note from the warden who had known Ethan. It said, "He always spoke kindly of you. He wanted you to know you were his only truth." Claire smiled softly, tears welling in her eyes. She placed the note inside her favorite book, and whispered that he didn't need to apologize anymore. The waves outside roared gently, carrying her words away like a message meant for somewhere far beyond reach. As the years passed, Claire's health began to fade. But she lived peacefully. The pain of the past no longer haunted her. It had transformed into quiet acceptance. Sometimes she dreamed of the old days, the laughter, the betrayal, the endings. But in her dreams they weren't painful anymore. They were simply stories, chapters in a life fully lived. When she passed away one calm night, she did so in her sleep, just like Ethan, a faint smile on her face. Peace had finally come for everyone who had carried that heavy story. After her death, the house was sold, and her belongings were sent to archives connected to the Cole Tower's history. Among them was her journal, where she had written, "We were all broken, but at least we tried to love." The curator read it and added it to the exhibit. Visitors often paused at that line, touched by its honesty. It became one of the tower's most quoted inscriptions, a quiet testament to imperfection. It reminded everyone who read it that failure doesn't erase humanity. It reveals it in its rawest form. The city moved forward, as cities always do, building new towers, new lives, new dreams. But on rainy nights, when lightning reflected on the glass of the Cole Tower, some swore they saw faint silhouettes inside. Two figures standing beside each other, looking out over the skyline. No one knew if it was real or imagination. Maybe it didn't matter. To those who believed, it was a sign that peace had found even the most broken souls. A quiet, lasting reminder that redemption in some form reaches everyone eventually. Years later, a writer visited the tower and turned the story into a book. A story not about power or crime, but about love, obsession, and the fine line between the two. The book ended with the same words Ethan had written in his journal: "Peace is not given, it's earned through truth." It became a bestseller, touching countless readers who saw their own flaws reflected in Ethan's journey. What began as a tragedy ended as a mirror, showing that even in failure, humanity still shines through. Decades after everything, the Cole Tower still stood, tall and unwavering. Its lights burned softly at night, casting reflections across the city Ethan once ruled. The red thread, preserved in glass at the exhibit, remained bright, untouched by time. People passed by it every day, unaware of its full story, yet still drawn to it. A single thread that once tied love, guilt, and redemption together. It was small, almost invisible, but powerful enough to outlast the lives that gave it meaning. That was its legacy, and theirs. And so the story of Ethan Cole ended, not in flames or scandal, but in silence and understanding. He had fallen from power, from love, from grace. Yet in the end he found what he had always searched for, peace. The world moved on, as it always does, but his lesson remained, that control built on fear will always collapse, and love without truth will always destroy. The tower stood tall, the rain kept falling, and life in its quiet mercy continued, carrying forward the echoes of a man who finally let go.